In this video, we want to talk about modules in Angular 4. Angular 1 introduced the concept of modules, and it allowed us to group similar pieces of functionalities and put them under one umbrella. So if we were registering a user, so if our application allowed us to register users, we would have a registration controller, a registration service, any kind of directives or filters that we would be using during the registration process. We'd group those together into one module, and then we would include that module into our main application, or our root module we can think of, and all that functionality would be available to us. Now, Angular 4 has really, they've kept that concept, but they've made it much stricter. It definitely does take time to wrap our heads around Angular 4 modules and the different bits and pieces. So you can see here I have a module pulled up just from a base app, and we have declarations, imports, providers, bootstrap, and there are other things such as exports and entry components. And it is very, it definitely can be a little intimidating, but once you actually understand all of these things, and it's really not that bad, but once you can grasp what's going on, a light bulb sort of goes off in your head, and you get that aha moment, and you really begin to understand why the Angular team did this in such a way where it's very different than Angular 1 and not as straightforward. And you'll realize that they're actually helping us build not only better code, but the ability to architect our application in a way that is scalable and much more concise. I think what we'll end up doing is, instead of going through keyword by keyword and really explaining what is a declaration, what is an import, provider, and bootstrap, let's actually go and try and build a couple components and package them into a module. And that way, when things break, we can sort of talk about why they broke and then fix them, and sort of explain the solution. So I think what we'll end up doing is creating a weather module with two components: a forecast for the week and today's weather. We're not going to get too fancy with these because, again, we want to understand what a module is and really the details of a module in Angular 4. We don't care as much about the implementation details. So we're not going to talk about fetching data from a service or even passing in your zip code or location to the component. So we're going to stub everything out and keep everything as simple as possible. Now, since writing components is a little out of scope for this, and we do want to save time and really talk about modules and components, I'm just going to go and create the components that we're going to use offline, and then we can sort of begin bringing them into our application and see where things break. So be back in a minute. All right, so you can see here we have a weather directory, and this is really storing our components. We have the two components. The forecast component is literally just giving us some hard-coded data, just the temperatures for the week, and today's weather. We have the temperature which we're referencing here, and we initialize that in the constructor. So now what we want to do is we want to go and wrap these into a weather module. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go and create our weather module. Okay, so let's go here and we'll say weather.module.ts, and then we're going to go here and use the ng module decorator. And for those interested, this did an auto import for me. This is a feature of IntelliJ and WebStorm. Another cool thing is you can actually do a control space on a Mac, and you can actually get the available keywords that this decorator supports. Now we actually see on the right that we do have an error going on. Okay, and that error is we need to actually export this. We have to create a class. So we'll do that real quick. We'll say export class weather module. Okay, that cleared up that error. Now let's go back up here and Declarations. So declarations is something that any module is going to need to have, and a declaration is really saying, okay, any components or pipes or directives, anything that belongs to or is used by this module needs to be added here. And it's important to know that anything here is private by default. So even if a module uses this, it doesn't have access to anything in declarations. So we're going to see that. So we're going to have in our declarations our two components, today's weather and the forecast component. All right, so here's our declarations, today's weather and forecast component. And if we go to our main module, our app.module, and we're gonna go and import. So import is where you go and import other modules. So declarations is where you declare anything that belongs to this module, and imports is where you import other modules whose functionality you want to use. So here we want to use the weather module. Okay, now that that's imported, let's go ahead and try and put the forecast. Let's see if it'll actually work. Okay, and it's building. Okay, it looks like it failed. Forecast, so here on template parser, forecast is not a known element. So you might be thinking, well, it is a known element, it's in our declarations, it's in the weather module. Well, that's not actually enough, unfortunately. So declarations is sort of letting this module know these are things that you need to use, but everything here is totally private. So no other module can actually see what's in the declarations array. To expose these, we actually need to make these public, and we can do that by using the exports keyword. Exports keyword is again another array, and in the exports keyword, anything that we declare is going to be completely public and accessible to other components. So let's go ahead and add these two components to the exports array, and we're going to go back and let this refresh, and lo and behold, we actually go and see the forecast. And if we go here, okay, we have our forecast. Now let's do one thing. Let's take out this today's weather component, so it's still private, and we just want to show that if we use the selector here, today's weather, is this actually going to work? And it's not. We're getting the same problem. So we're going to go back here and we're going to paste that back in, and now that this is an export, it's public and the module should see it. Now both of these components are getting this data statically. It's not dynamic, it's hard-coded. So let's create a weather service that will return this data for us, and let's see how that changes things in the module declaration. So we can go back here and we can create a weather service. We'll export the class. We'll decorate this with the injectable decorator. We'll create a constructor. Well, it'll just be empty for now. We'll have our two functions. Get temperature, and we'll return 25. We'll also get the forecast, and we'll just return this string right here. Now the only thing to do is to inject the weather service into our components and use these functions. I'm going to pause the video while I plug all that in, and I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so we've plugged in our weather service into both the forecast component and the today's weather component. So you can see here we have the weather service, which is in the providers array, and we are grabbing the forecast from this function that we defined, and we have the same thing going on for the today's weather component. Now let's just make sure that this is running. We're going to do a quick refresh, and it's here, so that looks good. Now you'll notice that this weather service is used by both the today's weather component and the forecast component. In order to use the weather service, we needed to add it to the provider's declaration in the component decorator. Now, if we added a third or a fourth component that would also need access to the weather service, we would need to do the same thing. We would need to add the provider's declaration to each decorator. Now, a way to avoid that is to move this weather service to the provider's declaration in the module. And what that does for us is it gives access to any component that is in our module will have direct access to the weather service, and it doesn't need to be redeclared. So what we'll do here is we're going to remove the provider's declaration, and we're also going to remove it from here. So both components no longer have it, and this should break. And it does, because we are not telling it where the weather service is. Now let's go to the actual weather module, and we can just declare it over here, and that should fix things for us. And there you go. So now all of our components have access to this weather service, even though we haven't directly declared it in our decorator. The last piece of a component that's important to know about are entry components. Entry components are components that Angular needs to know about in order to compile them so that they're available to the app. And it's just going to be another array, just like everything else, except these are going to be components that are not directly used in any of our templates, and Angular needs to know which components might you dynamically inject or might be used that are not in a template per se, but could be, so that the compiler can go and compile those and create the necessary offline factories so that those can be used. So that's when you'd use entry components. And it's, if you're doing anything sort of dynamic, that's most likely where entry components are going to come into play. But for, depending on what you're doing, but for the most part, entry components are not going to be something you're going to be, doing a lot of. So I hope this video helped shed some light on modules and the explanations were clear. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to shoot me an email or leave a comment below. Until next time.